Today's video features several of the most recognised names in the annals of Golden Age gaming. However, perhaps not in a way that you would expect, or necessarily want. We're going to the era of the PS2, Xbox and GameCube, specifically the PS2, and looking at several attempts at taking a much loved and respected name from the arcades of the 1980s and modernising it, giving it all a big old glow up, a whopping great refurb, and general modernisation to make it all very contemporary. Well, contemporary for the 2000s anyway. Because that was, at least for a time, seen as what needed to be done to get some more juice from these sad old gits. Forget about any of the cool things they did before. Chuck a flip phone into their hands, force them into an ill-fitting pair of Evisu jeans and a Von Dutch t-shirt, and say that actually Defender, Dragon's Lair and Space Invaders are thoroughly down with the youths. That Jamie and Darren off Gamesville will be raising the roof with their praise of these titles. Yeah, as you might expect, this didn't happen, but even if for the most part we're not covering the best titles here, there is at least a little bit of interest to be found, as well as a big heaping dollop of wondering what was going on in a lot of these guys' heads. I have 10 of these strange PS2 era reboots to look at. Some of them are good and some of them are obviously quite bad. Let's get a move on. There is perhaps no more appropriate place to start than with this, the game that originally kicked off the Golden Age. Space Invaders. For years the most successful game in all of the land, little really needs to be said about Tomohiro Nishikado's classic. But how do you update this so that it might appeal to a new generation? I'm sure a lot of you think the answer's pretty easy. You retain the classic gameplay, give it a big old ravey coat of paint, all sorts of music and effects, and boom! You've got 2008 Space Invaders Extreme, a handheld beaut of a title that absolutely nails it in every way, bringing those shimmying aliens back to the forefront after 20 years. Great game. But you forgot the attempt to do it before that one, didn't you? Either you weren't aware of Space Invaders Invasion Day, or you purposefully blanked it out. But in any case, this 2002 title, also known as Space Raiders if you're in North America, was Taito's crack at taking Space Invaders, making it all serious, and bringing it to the gritty stylings of the early 2000s. It bombed utterly, for reasons that are gonna be pretty obvious. Some bright spark thought that the main thing that Space Invaders was missing all this time was some sort of storyline, so that's what you get here. The aliens have come to Earth, swarming the streets and killing everything in sight. You play as one of 3 characters who've taken it upon themselves to stop these bastards single-handedly. A cop named Naj, a photographer named Ashley, and an annoying teenager called Justin. You pick up a gun and you get to work, battling wave upon wave of aliens in the streets through 6 levels. You may get the odd cutscene here and there, and as you might expect, the voice acting and script here is impeccable.
Don't hate me because I kill you.
So in the end, you do get slightly similar gameplay to the original. You can only move left and right at the bottom of the screen and defend yourself against those waves, although you do have more in the way of power-ups to use. So what exactly doesn't work here? There's just an absolute mindlessness about this one. It feels like a whole bunch of enemies and crap that's just been chucked onto the screen at random for you to shoot at, and honestly it doesn't take long before the whole thing gets very repetitive very quickly. Pretty soon you'll start getting the zombie-like enemies, and if you're not rolling your eyes before that point, well, you probably will be then. More successful reimaginings of the original classics, such as the aforementioned Extreme or the earlier Super Space Invaders, retained a fair bit of faithfulness to the original even when they were trying new things. While this? Well, it's just a bunch of random nonsense. If this game were to come out today, you'd think that it was made up of nothing but a bunch of royalty-free assets, with nothing original actually created at all. You get boss battles at the end of each stage, and these don't exactly help matters much either. And you can continue as many times as you want, so feel free to have at it if you really want to brute force your way to the end of this title. This feeling is exacerbated by the graphics themselves, which are, of course, terrible. These aren't the worst graphics that we'll be seeing in the video, but they're very typical PS2 era garbage that is trying to be realistic, I suppose, which again feels so absurd when the game that we're dealing with is frickin' Space Invaders. And that's the whole problem. Not only is Invasion Day meddling with a title that is so glorious, that's so sacred, it's trying to do the impossible with it, things that Space Invaders was never designed for and is useless at. The whole Space Invaders formula is designed for quick blasts, a thoroughly exciting seat-of-the-pants 5-minute hit of gameplay, whether that's the original or extreme or whatever. This is arcade gaming in its purest form, and it's not exactly built for lengthy single sessions. The last thing it needs is some frickin' storyline or 2-hour campaign mode. After just a few minutes, you've already essentially seen everything that Invasion Day has on offer, and it's just doing the same thing over and over again in a painfully generic setting, where the only real motivation is seeing what ghastly lines the script's gonna throw up next.
I did it. Well, this new suit really works. Now I won't ever be beaten.
Is that enough? Course not. Invasion Day was, alas, a game that got scorched utterly in just about all outlets, and it very quickly retreated from the game shop shelves, never to be spoken of again. Until now. Sticking in the shoot 'em up realm, here's our next ravaged classic. Not quite as bad as the last game, although still pretty questionable on the whole. Defender. This 2002 reimagining, outside of the States, is known as Defender for All Mankind, and at least here on the PS2, Midway have tasked 7 studios with bringing Eugene Jarvis's thunderous 1981 behemoth into the present day. Now, the idea of a Defender-style game only in 3D, is that new? Not totally. For those of you with a predilection towards the Amiga, you may well be thinking of the 1994 title Guardian, one of the MIGI's most successful stabs at 3D, and a game with a very similar mix of beating off waves of enemies and protecting your assets on the ground. For All Mankind's play isn't exactly far away from this, although it is a bit more complex. The main aim, alongside beating those pesky aliens back, is to grab humans on the ground and take them over to a drop zone, which must also be defended from the enemy forces. Picking up and dropping off these humans is easy enough. They'll automatically grab onto your ship as soon as you fly at them, and leave as soon as you touch down in the drop zone. So at least that's welcome. In some parts you can see a bit of potential here. Defender for All Mankind at least keeps things like plot to something of a minimum, seeing as it's hardly that necessary in a game like this. Just a bit of perfunctory text that's the smallest bit of window dressing to another arena filled with alien scum. There's a whole bunch of weapons and upgrades and power-ups and all that, more so than there is in something like Invasion Day, as well as a couple of different ships to choose from. So the variation in the game can't really be knocked. But at its core, is it all that fun? Would you ever choose to play it over, well, the original Defender? The answer, I'm afraid, is no. Playing Defender in 3D just doesn't work out well enough. You get a simplified 3D space shooter experience that kind of gets pared down in several of the one places. One where there's no real middle ground between either aimlessly firing at waves of aliens and hitting nothing, or mindlessly using the auto-aimed missiles without bothering to so much as look at the enemy ships you're aiming at. It doesn't take too long for it to all feel like a chore, and once again we're not exactly dealing with much quality on the graphical or sonic fronts. Almost as soon as you really start playing, you're looking for excuses to stop bothering with it, or at least I am. So even though this is definitely better made and a bit more engaging than a complete and total failure like Space Invaders Invasion Day, I'm afraid it's not all that far ahead, and it's not a game that I'm likely to ever pick up again.
Alert, alert. Command vector readings indicate Manti lander headed for dropships. Directive. Please intercept and destroy Manti lander.
Now, not all the games I'm covering here are necessarily ones that I dislike. Believe it or not, we've got a vaguely even split going on. This next one is a game that's actually pretty fine. It certainly could have been worse, and although it can be a little bit rough around the edges, it's trying to do something modern with a well-known and highly loved Golden Age title in a way that is still actually pretty faithful to the original, and largely it manages to succeed. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about Dragon's Lair 3D. Now, this was far from the first attempt at taking Dirk Lederin and bringing his adventures to a game with a little bit more meat on it than the Laserdisc QuickTime Event Fest from whence it came from. It's just that, well, the previous attempts were all quite terrible indeed. Dragon's Lair 3D, an Ubisoft-published title from 2002, made by a rather small team known as Dragonstone Software with full blessings and occasional guidance from Don Bluth, Rick Dyer and Gary Goldman, ends up being a much more worthy attempt that clearly comes from a place of love for the original, and it's definitely worth a look. This is, of course, a platformer once again, but now it's a 3D one, and honestly that works a lot better for a reimagining of Dragon's Lair than 2D ever could. It just feels right, especially seeing as this game does actually go to a lot of effort to recreate a lot of the famed set pieces and sequences from the original, taking something like the duel with the robot knight, for example, complete with the electrified floor. Well, that's obviously going to work a lot better in 3D than it could ever hope to in 2D. The game goes for a cel-shaded look, which is, again, an excellent choice. It really helps to make the game's graphics look faithful to Bluth's work. The camera can, as it often is in 3D platformers, be a little bit of a pain in the arse, and the movement can be a little bit shaky here and there, but I must say that it is actually pretty decent in this department compared to some of the other games we're going to see. Honestly, the technical issues usually aren't annoying enough to really detract from the action significantly. It's the sort of game where it doesn't take long to get used to any of the foibles that might be there. All of this happily means it's easier to concentrate on that faithfulness. Naturally, all the familiar cast of Dragon's Lair are here, with Princess Daphne as ever getting herself captured by Mordroc the Wizard and Singe the Dragon, although she is now able to guide you through an amulet, so she does at least have a somewhat meatier part to play in the story than normal. That and she also gets a few funny lines, especially when you concentrate too much on hunting for treasure rather than going for the main task at hand.
Your sword. Treasure hunting? I'm in peril? And you're collecting gold?
There are plenty of puzzles, there's a fair bit of fighting which actually doesn't come off badly at all, and yes, there are some bastardy insta-death gotchas. In fairness, it wouldn't really be Dragon's Lair without them. Still, lives are infinite and checkpoints are plentiful, so dying isn't really a big issue here. It's not exactly the most challenging game ever made, but then it doesn't really need to be. It's got a nice nostalgia about it, and even with the slight bits of jank kicking around, it definitely does a fine job of taking the Dragon's Lair story and aesthetic into a whole new genre. This game didn't make much of an impact at all back in 2002, generally getting middling reviews at best, but if you've got any kind of fondness for Dragon's Lair, I'd give this one a go. Pac-Man was probably one of the first names that sprung into your mind when you saw the topic for this video. After all, Namco's almighty Dot Eater has taken many trips outside of his regular old mazy surroundings. Hell, that started all the way back in the good old days, with Pac-Land. You may well have expected that we keep going with 3D platformers and have a quick rush through the Pac-Man World titles. They span the PS1 and the PS2, they're pretty popular, and they certainly take Pac into some odd directions. But nah, I've got something a bit different in mind. While it would be very obvious to say that Pac-Man World wouldn't exist without Super Mario 64, that is basically true of 99% of all 3D platformers at their core. So instead, I've got two games that are a bit more blatant in their Italian plumber aping ways. First off, we've got Pac-Man Does Mario Kart, and then after that we've got Pac-Man Does Mario Party. Pac-Man Rally, or Pac-Man World Rally, is a Mario Kart-esque game from 2006 where the whole Pac family and everyone's favourite ghosts do battle on a variety of tracks, with the usual power-ups dotted around and whatnot. So many of these games play so damn similarly to each other, so the big question is where, if anywhere at all, does this one differ? Now there are actually a couple of areas, the main ones revolving around how the usual practice of eating up dots and fruits gets incorporated into the race. Being the first to eat a fruit on the track does have an interesting effect, as it opens up shortcuts on the track, but only to whichever racer happens to eat said fruit, so it's obviously worth grabbing those as soon as possible. Eating up dots fills up a big old meter that unlocks the Pac-Mobile. This is basically like a power pellet, giving you a speed boost and turning every other racer into edible ghosts. And then you have another meter that fills up through doing power slides. When filled, you can trigger a guardian that temporarily protects you from attacks, so there's a way to block even the blue shell-esque power-ups that are in this game. That said, these aren't as brutal as they are in a Mario Kart game, so there is definitely a bit more focus on keeping the racers close. The graphics and the track layouts are decent, there's plenty of multiplayer options, and there are some things that do make this game a bit different from other, more standard Mario Kart clones. So yeah, Pac-Man Rally really isn't that bad an effort in the end. The contemporary reviews for this game once again are very average indeed, most of them were in the 5 or 6 out of 10 range, but it's actually a pretty good Mario Kart alternative. But what about this other one? Is Pac-Man Fever, a game from 2002, a good Mario Party alternative? No. No, it most certainly isn't. This title doesn't just feature Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man, it also has a few other Namco stars. Heihachi and Tiger from Tekken, Astaroth from Soul Calibur, and Reiko from Ridge Racer. And you compete either on your own or ideally with your friends on one of 3 boards, earning tokens and trying to get to the end first through playing plenty of minigames. And in this instance, the minigames are all thoroughly basic and boring, completely lacking in any personality. It feels like the result of one solitary brainstorm that resulted in the most standard ideas for minigames that you can possibly imagine, and then no one actually bothered to add any more. As casual as these games are, the thing that absolutely kills Pac-Man Fever is its complete lack of any sort of Namco-based identity beyond the 6 characters that are available to you and the odd ghost kicking about. Scarcely anything else in the game has any relation to Pac-Man whatsoever, or indeed much of anything by Namco. Hell, why wouldn't you do something as simple as calling the tokens that you get dots? That's what Pac-Man deals in, dots. Not bloody tokens! Pac-Man Rally may also not have a huge Namco identity in its tracks, but it incorporates enough familiar gameplay elements to be able to carry it off, whereas this is basically the definition of having the Temu Mario Party at home. Hell, it doesn't even feature the Buckner and Garcia song of the same name, which you might have expected to hear. However, in this instance, there was actually an attempt by Namco to include said song, but according to programmer Bob Hickman, they couldn't get the rights to it. I am afraid that this is a rather poor showing indeed, definitely one of the weakest titles in the entire Pac-Man canon, and it appears to have sunk like a stone, with the few reviews there are of it being uniformly negative. This is the sort of title that would be described, in the most non-committal of terms, as one for the die-hard completists. SpyHunter was a curious choice for a 6th generation revamp, indeed one of the most visible ones around. Mind you, when you think about it, Midway may have had a little unfinished business here. Sure, the original is a justified classic, cultural touchstone, a much loved game, arcade juggernaut, all of that. But then you had the arcade sequel, which was critically torn apart, and a total flop. Super SpyHunter's pretty decent over on the NES, but well, the damage was done. There weren't exactly as many SpyHunter games as some might have thought there were, and really a 3D driving combat game with the SpyHunter name attached? That makes lots of sense. Hell, a load more sense than most of the ideas on display here. And so, SpyHunter ends up hitting the PS2's shelves in the autumn of 2001, a fairly early game for the system, one that had originally been set for the N64 at the beginning of its development a couple of years previously. This first SpyHunter ends up being a solid 3D entry into the canon because it doesn't exactly change a lot. You play as a secret special super elite agent named Alex Sects, for yes, that is his name. You're in a whopper of a vehicle called the G6155 Interceptor that can change into either a car or a boat at the blink of an eye, or a motorcycle in fact. And you're taking down a criminal organisation called Nostra who wants to rule the world. The plot is rudimentary and simple, just window dressing for a whole bunch of levels where you bash around and complete enough objectives in order to unlock the next one. A style of play that kind of makes this feel like a more action-packed take on Tony Hawk. The soundtrack is absolutely chock full of variations on the Peter Gunn theme. There's a bunch of weapons to play with, including several of the original's classics like oil slicks and smoke screens, and tons of very familiar enemies appear for those who've played the original. Them road lords, they're as tough to deal with as ever. It's SpyHunter in 3D, and honestly, it's jolly good indeed. This is exactly what you would want out of a 3D version of SpyHunter. The arcade style of gameplay has been thoroughly retained, and while it's obviously not the prettiest title of the 6th generation, it was a hit. People really enjoyed the first SpyHunter, and it sold fairly close to 1 million copies. There was a sequel in 2003 that wasn't quite as fully enjoyed, but it did pretty much provide more of the same sort of action. More weapons, more enemies, and more stages kind of sequel, with a couple more cutscenes and a companion named Agent Duvel who was based on Vanessa Carlton, of all people. She also provided the game's theme song.
Approaching weapons boat.
This is fine and all of that, but as perfectly fine as these games are, SpyHunter 1 and 2 aren't necessarily the games I want to talk about. Of course, I want to talk about the third game, where it managed to go thoroughly tits up in spectacular fashion. The strange case of a game that was supposed to come out in conjunction with a big blockbuster movie based on SpyHunter with a big starter match. But even though that movie ended up getting cancelled, the game still came out, and good lord is it a pile of cack. Of course, we're talking about SpyHunter Nowhere to Run from 2006, the Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson vehicle that does about as much for the good name of Frequels as Driver 3 did a couple of years previously. The story of the film itself is worth going into a little. Universal picked up the SpyHunter license from Midway in 2002 with the idea that it was going to be The Rock's main superstar vehicle, much more so than any other film he was working on at the time. It was, by all accounts, set to be a franchise, with plenty of comparisons to Tom Cruise and Mission Impossible. John Woo was initially set to direct the flick in 2004, with a release set for 2005, but then he dropped out of the project. Proposed schedules for the production came and went after that, and the script got rewritten a whole load of times, all while The Rock worked on various other flicks for Universal. Eventually it became clear that the tie-in game for the franchise was going to come out before the movie ever did. Midway had to get the damn thing out already and make some money from it, and so Nowhere to Run hit the shelves in September of 2006. One good thing about the first 2 SpyHunter games is that they don't have a whole lot of bloat on them, and it's never too long before you're straight into the action. This, on the other hand, good grief, more bloated than a drowned Jabba the Hutt. You are Special Agent Alex Decker, as played and voiced by The Rock, People's Eyebrow and all, and Nostra are still doing their evil organisation things. Immediately, this is the sort of game where you essentially end up doing all the boring and mundane shit. All the actually exciting events happen in cutscenes, and there's a lot of them. Sometimes it feels like you get 30 seconds of play in between long and utterly moribund cutscenes, which is always great. Also, this game features much less of the vehicular combat that you really want out of a SpyHunter game. Instead, it features plenty of dreadful on-foot sections where you have to fight against the typical bad camera and controls, a hideously stiff cover system, and absolutely bollocks aiming. Those are all much bigger threats than Nostra are, believe me. The only even vaguely amusing thing to do here is to stun enemies in close combat, allowing you to perform a couple of wrestling finishes on them. And yes, this naturally includes the rock bottom. Everything else on foot is absolute garbage, and the vehicle action isn't even remotely as fun as it was in the first two titles. I couldn't possibly bear to put myself through the entirety of this title, as just like Lara Croft in Angel of Darkness, I'm not strong enough. Although as you might expect, it does eventually resolve into a cliffhanger of an ending, something that was supposed to hype up a movie which would, of course, never come. As it was, the general plot of Nowhere to Run didn't have that much to do with any possible SpyHunter movie. Unsurprisingly, the folks at Midway never ended up seeing any of the script's 500 or so drafts. Along with providing voice, The Rock did do mocap for the game, and according to a 2023 Time Extension article, he actually was an absolute joy to work with, so at least there's that. In the end, the absolute critical and commercial failure of SpyHunter Nowhere to Run didn't have a particularly huge effect on the fate of the SpyHunter movie, although the chaos surrounding said movie certainly had an impact on the game, which by all accounts the developers just could never quite get a handle on. Too much interference, too much confusion, and a rather vicious crunch at the end. It reviewed terribly, with The Rock retrospectively taking the piss out of it somewhat years later, taking ironic umbrage at a 3 out of 10 Game Informer score for the game at the Game Awards in 2017. The SpyHunter film still kicked around for quite some time, even as it was clear that old Dwayne had less and less interest in it, was clearly treating it as a bit of a lost cause, and was becoming a successful action hero through other means and franchises. Video game movie regular Paul W.S. Anderson was attached to direct in 2007, but dropped out a year later. Warner Brothers took over the rights to the movie when they bought out the now bankrupt Midway in 2009, and the last anyone heard of the SpyHunter film was 2015, when yet another script rewrite was announced. While the project hasn't ever been officially declared dead, it is most certainly resting, in the same sense that a Norwegian blue parrot is resting. Our next game may be from a more obscure series in the West, but it's a pretty damned important one regardless. Namco's The Tower of Druaga from 1984 is a whopper of an arcade game, a hugely important touchstone for the whole action RPG genre, a game that the likes of Zelda or the Ys series likely wouldn't even exist without, and one that kicked off an entire series of titles known as the Babylonian Castle Saga. Everything from direct arcade sequel, The Return of Ishtar, to Famicom platformer Quest of Key, full-on dungeon crawling SFC RPG Blue Crystal Rod, and plenty more. And now, here on the PS2 and in 3D, we have the Nightmare of Druaga from 2004. This is kind of odd, as this isn't just a Namco Babylonian Castle Saga game, it's a Chunsoft mystery dungeon title that's developed by Eureka. This is a whole other series of games, one largely defined by crossovers. It started out with a Super Famicom title called Torneco's Great Adventure, starring a shopkeeper from Dragon Quest IV, has had various entries into other franchises such as Pokemon, Final Fantasy in the form of Chocobo Dungeon, Etrian Odyssey and Twinbee, as well as its own original series of titles, Shiren the Wanderer. There's a whole lot here, but Nightmare of Druaga is the crossover between Babylonian Castle Saga and Mystery Dungeon, and unlike the majority of games in either of these series, it's actually made an appearance outside of Japan, released in North America in October of 2004. The Nightmare of Druaga does feature an appropriately big plot where Prince Gilgamesh, or Gil, is just about to marry Key, only for her to damn well get captured again. But whereas the original Tower of Druaga was naturally based around climbing up a gigantic heavenly structure, Nightmare goes to various locales and is generally based on going further down into the depths. It's certainly got a pretty nifty challenge about it. The punishments for dying, or rather being incapacitated, are severe indeed, and there's a lot of little quirks to learn about the title, some of which are the sort you may well already be familiar with if you know the form of these games, and others which are pure Druaga, such as completing an unknown yet rather random set of instructions in order to reveal the most valuable and even essential treasures. Still, as is often the case with mystery dungeon games, a lot of Nightmare of Druaga is going to be based around entering dungeons, going down the floors, getting better and getting as far as you can before it gets too hot down there, escaping, sucking it up and going back in. It's the classic roguelike tradition, without the random flaws or anything like that. There's a fair bit more meat on the plot here than you would find in an older Druaga title, which may well be up your street. Personally, I'm not all that bothered about it, but I can certainly appreciate this as a nice bout of going around dungeons, trying to explore every little nook and cranny, and gradually beefing up Gil so that he can take on bigger challenges. It's not totally my cup of tea as a game, but it's absolutely fine. The graphics and music, well, they're functional more than anything, but not exactly offensive unlike some games here. Looking at reviews of the game, particularly contemporary ones, you can imagine how some critics reacted to it. The likes of Game Informer and GameSpot absolutely slammed it for its repetition, brutality, and uncompromising obtuseness compared to more standard RPGs of the age, but others who were more familiar with the form, such as the almighty Jeremy Parish for One Up, were far more positive about Nightmare of Druaga, and knew exactly what this game was going for. Honestly, it's a surprise this even got a release in the West at all, but I'm sure there were at least 20 or so people who thoroughly appreciated it at the time, and nowadays it is certainly intriguing, and a very different kettle of fish to the other games that we're looking at here. Right, the next title isn't strictly Golden Age, but there's no way I could do this video and not cover this title. Easily the worst one we're doing, and one of the cringiest games you can possibly get. In 1989, there was Final Fight, and it was really freaking good. Part of a huge all-conquering wave of belt-scrolling beat-em-ups where thug after thug was pile-driven, roundhouse kicked, and otherwise chinned by a trio of badasses. Final Fight didn't really get a direct arcade sequel, although it did have some decent ones in the home. Mighty Final Fight on the NES, 2 and 3 on the SNES, all good stuff here. Final Fight Revenge hits the arcades in the mid-90s and turns it into a fighting game, much to most people's distress. I actually have a soft spot for Revenge, but most don't. But make no mistake, it is absolutely glorious compared to what's next. In 2006, Capcom released Final Fight Streetwise for PS2, putting a huge brown mark on the franchise forever. While Final Fight has kind of been fully incorporated into the Street Fighter universe nowadays, this remains the last main entry into the series. And there hasn't been a worse finish to her career since Gene Hackman starred in Welcome to Mooseport. The story here goes that initially, Capcom's Studio 8 were working on a title called Final Fight 7 Sons, which could have possibly featured all 7 characters from the previous 3 main Final Fight games. Footage of a working beta is available courtesy of Unseen64, and what we have here is a much more arcadey game, with brighter cel-shaded graphics that's more of an attempt at emulating the look of the original, and a more arcadey structure consisting of levels where you simply move forwards. No hub world or anything. It looks okay enough, but was apparently deemed to not be American enough by higher ups, and so Studio 8 went for something grittier and more story driven. Streetwise is the unfortunate result. You play as Kyle Travers, Cody's younger brother, and you've got to rid the Metro City streets of a drug called Glow while saving your bro from whatever pickle he's gotten himself into. There's all sorts of plot, all sorts of cutscenes, and it's all utterly abysmal. Even appearances from other Final Fight alumni, whether it be Andor, or Guy, or Mayor Hagar himself, cannot possibly save the wretched story. It certainly is gritty, in the sense that playing this will leave you thoroughly salty about all the time that you are wasting. The thing is, the regular act of fighting in this game isn't necessarily terrible. You do all the punching and the blocking and all of that. You can get yourself more moves, use an instinct system to dodge and unleash the odd finisher, chuck folks around. That's not bad, although the camera is a serious load of crap. There's a lot of the times where it gets so close in that you're not able to see just who you're punching, which is always amusing. The worst thing about Streetwise is absolutely everything between the fighting. The endless, pointless roaming around this utter brown hole of a place called Metro City. Seriously, the graphics are absolutely miserable. The most awful, fickle hue covers everything. Day and night are essentially the same. It's a sight for sore eyes. Worst graphics in the whole of this video, by a long way. The relentless, uncompromising hideousness of this hub world pretty much kills Streetwise outright, but in the end it's not like there's a whole lot of meat on it. It's always a big red flag when a significant chunk of the action consists of mini-games where you stomp rats, arm wrestle, and even solve frickin' slide puzzles. There is an arcade mode option available which does trim a fair bit of the fat off of this load of blubber, as well as allowing you to play as Cody and, eventually, Guy and Hagar. However, playing this arcade mode in full requires you to all but complete the horrid story mode first, so that's a massive bummer to say the least. As far as putting one final finishing boot into this title, this is a 2006 game. Two immediate PS2 beat-em-up contemporaries spring to mind, Rockstar's The Warriors from 2005 and Clover's God Hand from 2006. I pretty much rest my case. Both of those games absolutely destroy this sorry site in every single department. The Warriors, in particular, is operating in the exact same grimy field that Streetwise is trying to be in, and there is no comparison between the two titles whatsoever. It's simply not fair. While I have certainly played quite a lot of games that, mechanically, are far worse than Final Fight Streetwise, the whole feel of this game and the, quite literally, shitty look of it are enough to put it way down there for me. It's a total stinker.
You weren't expecting this, were you? I'm wanting you, you stupid bastard!
Yeah, I know.
No!
Not the face. Damn, Cody. I'm gonna have to kick his ass too when this is over.
So, we've just had the worst title in the video, but it's customary that we finish on a high, and so here's the best one. Here we have a name that's not necessarily amongst the elite of 80s arcade titles, although certainly a respected one, and we have a game that actually follows on quite nicely from the direction that this particular series was going in, and the end result is a stunning title, a real gem from the 6th generation that's fully worth playing and honestly is more than deserving of a proper revival. This is Rygar, the Legendary Adventure, a 2002 title from Tecmo. This whole thing got started with the original arcade Rygar from 1986, a very solid side-scrolling game where you, a legendary warrior, take out various fantastical enemies with your disc armour, a big bladed shield on a chain. A fine arcade game, and one that got plenty of ports. But it was the 1987 NES version of Rygar that would take the title into an even better direction, turning Rygar into more of an adventure complete with various action RPG elements, like improving your fighter over time and whatnot. Now, 15 years after that title, we have this game, originally for the PS2 only. As you might expect from the game's subtitle, Rygar the Legendary Adventure is much more in line with the NES version, as opposed to the arcade original, being something of a 3D Metroidvania. Rygar's 3D action naturally comes all wrapped up in a pretty large and involved story, at least when compared to most of the other games we're covering in this video, in which initially the evil titans have invaded the mythical island of Argus and captured Princess Harmonia, forcing Rygar, the legendary warrior himself, to pull out that disc armour and do serious damage. But of course everything does end up being bigger than this damsel in distress story, and the entire world is at stake. It's not exactly deep, but it's certainly a thrilling ride through all sorts of ancient Greek and Roman influenced fantasy, one that wears its influences from Ray Harryhausen flicks and the like on its sleeve. The action itself is very nice, especially if you're into contemporaries like, say, Devil May Cry. 2 buttons for light and heavy attacks open up a whole range of combos, and as you progress through the game you'll have a whole bunch of disc armors at your disposal, complete with their own sets of moves and their own familiars to summon. That and you'll also unlock plenty of new abilities that allow you to reach new areas or go back to older ones and explore them further. The sort of thing you expect in any game like this. It's not a game that has a whole lot of trouble grabbing your attention, even after all this time. There's immediately a lot of fun to be found in the combat and the exploration, and it just gets better once you really get stuck into the world of Argus as a whole, and into more of the boss battles and the things that you can do with those disc armors. It certainly helps as well that this game is absolutely lovely looking, bright, beautiful, and thoroughly inventive. I am, as always, using emulation to capture these titles, and this is certainly one that benefits greatly from the enhanced resolutions that PCSX2 offers, but it did look fabulous to begin with. Now, all of this said, there is one major issue with this title that you may have noticed already: the dreaded fixed camera angles. Yes, these can be a right pain, constantly having to deal with the shifts in angles and movement directions, especially in combat. Rygar even commits the cardinal sin of having shifts in camera angles that reverse your controls from what they were, usually meaning that you end up going straight back into the angle you were previously in. So yeah, this is annoying. It's not a total deal breaker, but it's certainly Rygar's biggest flaw. It is the sort of reason why it would have been great to see a big old proper remaster of this title, one that gives the game a proper third-person angle behind our hero, Subsistence-esque I suppose. Alas, that didn't happen. There was a remaster of the game in 2009 for the Wii called Rygar: The Battle of Argus. However, this did not change the fixed camera angles, and in most people's eyes it actually made changes to the graphics that were considerably worse than the original, with Rygar in particular getting a, rather questionable makeover. Not exactly a successful remastering job then, but the PS2 original is certainly still worth playing, especially if you're into action titles. It's the best game in this video, that's for damn sure. And with that, we are about done here. There are certainly more games that could have featured in this selection. Pac-Man World's already been mentioned, there's a big old Frogger-based 3D platformer, the action-packed and thoroughly challenging Shinobi, Sega Ages stuff aplenty, no doubt a few other obscurities kicking around, and hell, plenty more out there just beyond the PS2. But it's always best to leave a few things to one side, just in case this topic gets revisited later on. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video and got something out of seeing the 10 games on display here, whether they're good or bad. Until the next time, bye for now.